Picture this. It's the turn of the 20th century, and a huge battle is raging for the very soul of the Catholic Church. But this wasn't a war fought with swords and armies. It was a war of ideas. On one side, you had the Vatican, standing guard over thousands of years of tradition. And on the other, a brand new wave of thinking that was threatening to turn everything upside down. This was the Modernist crisis.
You know, back in 1907, Pope Pius X did not mince words. I mean, listen to that. He saw this new way of thinking not as some small disagreement, but as a dagger aimed at the heart of the Church. He said these people were like a disease hidden in the very veins and heart of the institution, trying to chop down the faith at its very root. For him, this wasn't just a problem, it was an existential threat.
And that really sets up the central mystery for us. Was there actually an organized movement called Modernism, a secret society trying to take down the Church from within? Or was this just a label the Pope basically made up to shut down a bunch of new, maybe uncomfortable ideas? The thinkers he was targeting, they'd tell you he was fighting a ghost, that he hadn't just condemned a heresy, he'd invented it. So let's play detective, look at the evidence, and figure out what was really going on here.
Okay, so our story really kicks off with Pope Pius X's big encyclical in 1907, Pascendi Dominici Gregis. In it, he called modernism the synthesis of all heresies. I mean, wow, that is an incredibly bold claim. He was saying that if you took every single error ever spoken against the faith and mashed them all together, what you'd get is modernism. So what was this monster he was describing?
Now here's what's so fascinating. The men at the center of this storm, guys like Alfred Loisy and George Terrell, they never ever called themselves modernists. They saw what they were doing as perfectly reasonable. Their goal was just to, help Catholicism catch up with the modern world. But while their stated goal sounded pretty harmless, the Pope was convinced that their methods, their whole philosophy, was a massive threat to the faith itself.
So, what was this philosophical core that the Pope found so incredibly dangerous? He argued that modernism wasn't just about questioning a few things in the Bible. No, he saw it as a complete, coherent system, and it was all built on two really revolutionary ideas about how we know things and where faith actually comes from.
The first pillar in the Pope's eyes was agnosticism. Now, this isn't atheism, it's different. It's the idea that our human reason, and by extension science and history, is basically trapped in the physical world. It can't step outside of what we can see and measure to prove God exists or to see him acting in history. This essentially builds a wall between faith and reason, making it impossible for God to be something you could ever study scientifically.
Okay, so if reason can't lead you to God, where does faith come from? Well, that brings us to the second pillar, something called vital immanence. The modernist view, as the Pope laid it out, was that faith starts with a feeling. It's a subconscious need for something divine that just kinda bubbles up from inside the human heart. So faith isn't a response to some external truth revealed by God. It's an internal experience and intuition.
And you can probably see where this is going, right? This has a huge implication. If every religion, Catholicism, Islam, Buddhism, you name it, all springs from the exact same internal religious sense, then what makes any single one of them uniquely true? Well, according to the Pope, the modernists basically concluded that all religions are true because they all come from this universal human feeling. Sure, Catholicism might be more developed or vivid, but it's not fundamentally different from any other faith.
So, if faith is just an internal feeling and not a response to fixed external truths, what does that do to the core beliefs of a religion, like its dogmas? Well, as you can probably guess, it changes absolutely everything.
According to the Pope's analysis, the modernists saw dogma as this living, evolving thing. It starts with that raw religious feeling, right? Then our intellect tries to capture that feeling in words or symbols. The Church then refines those symbols into official dogma. But, and this is the absolute key, because human experience is always changing, the symbols themselves have to change too. For modernists, dogmas weren't timeless truths, they were just temporary containers for a deeper feeling.
Now, this view was in direct head-on collision with traditional Catholic teaching. The First Vatican Council had been crystal clear. Dogmas were a divine deposit given to the Church. The meaning of a dogma, once it was declared, had to be held on to forever. It was something to be guarded, not something that could just evolve or be thrown away for a new understanding. You can just feel the crash coming, can't you?
Let's look at how this all played out with the most central figure in Christianity, Jesus himself. The modernist approach, as Pius X saw it, basically split Jesus in two. You had the Christ of history, the actual man who lived and walked the earth, a purely human figure that a historian could study,
someone who did nothing that we would call divine. And then you had the Christ of faith. This was the divine being created by the believer's inner religious feeling. This Christ never really existed in history. He only existed inside the believer's heart.
So when you're faced with a system that you believe dismantles dogma, splits Christ in two, and puts all religions on the same level, Pope Pius X felt he had no other choice but to act. And his response was swift, it was systematic, and it was severe.
First came a decree called Lamentabile, and this wasn't a debate. It was a verdict. The Holy Office simply published a list of 65 ideas from modernist writers and declared them errors. End of story. The message couldn't have been clearer. Ideas like truth is no more unchangeable than man himself were now officially out of bounds for Catholics.
But the Pope went way beyond just condemning ideas. Pasquandi laid out this comprehensive top-to-bottom plan to completely wipe modernism out of the Church. He set up councils of vigilance, basically watchdog committees, in every diocese to hunt for heresy. Anyone even suspected of modernist leanings was to be kicked out of teaching positions. It created this chilling effect, an atmosphere of suspicion where a simple accusation could ruin your career. This was an all-out war on an idea.
And you know what? The crackdown was effective. Modernism as a major intellectual force inside the Church was pretty much silenced for decades. But the questions it raised, they never really went away. The conflict left this permanent mark on Catholic thinking.
So when you boil it all down, the modernist crisis really comes down to this fundamental clash. On one side, you have tradition, the idea of fixed truth, of divine revelation that's guarded by the Church's authority. And on the other side, you have evolution, the idea that truth changes, that it's rooted in our own human experience and our individual conscience. That tension between external authority and internal experience is the real legacy of this whole crisis.
And that brings us to the final question, really. It's the one this whole historical drama forces us to think about. How does an institution that's built on what it believes are eternal truths, how does it navigate a world that is constantly changing, with new science and new philosophies popping up all the time? The battle that was fought 100 years ago over modernism is still echoing in that very question today.